Now, before I start this lecture, I have to confess I'm haunted by an anxiety. And the anxiety is drifting into a cliche, and the cliche is a well-known one in Victorian studies. It should carry the name Faith and Doubt in Victorian Poetry. And I do not want to get into that territory. So I'm going to try and take a different perspective and perhaps a different emphasis. But to begin with, I want to expand the terms of reference from the Victorian period to, in fact, the last 500 years. And I'm doing this with the help of a man called Charles Taylor, who wrote a monumental work, some 840 pages long, called A Secular Age. We, his argument is, are living in a secular age, secular being, if you like, I won't say the opposite, but the antithesis to sacred. We live, this is in fact, you could argue that secularism and modernity are coextensive. They're not quite the same thing, but they are coextensive. So this is what he says. This is unusually simple for Taylor, by the way. If you want to read the book, you need your wits about you. But he asks quite simply, why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in 1500, while in the year 2000, many of us find this lack of belief not only easy, but inescapable? That's the period of 500 years which I have sublabeled modernity as well as secularism. Now, one of the points he talks about, he talks about many, many points, and he's often subtle, nuanced, and complex. But what I want to highlight is what he says about nature. The great invention of the West was that of an immanent order in nature. And Taylor adds that henceforth the working of nature could be systematically understood and explained on its own terms. What's the connection, or what is the source of this? He gives it to us in a footnote. The modern West, in the modern West, for the first time, especially with post-Galilean science, including, of course, Isaac Newton, the immanent order becomes more than a theory. It is rather the background to all our thinking. And by background, Taylor means it's almost a coercive part of our cultural formation. It's something we almost take for granted. We don't even query it. This is the way, the perspective that is offered to us, and we accept it. Now, the other person mentioned by Taylor early on is a figure who is known as one of the early sociologists. You may know this quotation. It's Max Weber, who lived from the late 19th to the early 20th. And he spoke in a wonderful word of the Entzauberung, the disenchantment of the world, including nature. I'm translating this as unmagicking, because disenchantment is a word that's all connotations. Unmagicking, or perhaps demystification of the world, including again nature. And I suppose what interests me about both of these quotations I've just given, one from Taylor, one from Weber, is that they talk about the nature of nature. And that is something which I will be trying to focus on. What is the nature of nature? It's a huge question. And I may end up speaking about it in generalities, at least until I come to the individual poems. Now, the second quotation I gave you from Taylor mentioned science, post-Galilean science, and the importance of science in the Victorian era is immediately indicated by just one name. That name is, of course, Charles Darwin, whose The Origin of Species was published in 1859. But the point I want here to emphasize is that even before that date, relevant scientific thinkers had begun to infiltrate and disturb, if that's the word, the culture. These included, just to give you this, Sir Charles Lyell, a close and influential friend of Darwin. His Principles of Geology appeared in 1830, 1833. And a man called Robert Chambers, who in his Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, 1844, again well before Darwin, he was in fact a powerful influence in popularizing an evolutionary view of nature. So these figures are crucial. In particular, we know the way they register in the culture because of one wonderful masterpiece of a poem, and it is Tennyson's In Memoriam. Tennyson's In Memoriam was deeply influenced. It was an elegy for his friend Arthur Hallam. Arthur Hallam died in his early 20s, and it's fair to say that Tennyson was heartbroken. In fact, to go back to the second of this morning's lecture, it is often debated as to whether Tennyson's relationship with Hallam was in fact homoerotic. Others argue that that kind of close male friendship was more common in Victorian times than it is in our own time. It was a part of the culture. Now, if nature is neutral, it can also seem indifferent. It has no feelings if it's neutral, so it is indifferent. And the elegy In Memoriam, though written over many decades, a couple of decades, was actually published in 1850, which, as it happens, is also the year of the death of Wordsworth. And I'll try and explain why that's important, or why it is a sort of strange coincidence in a moment. But nature in this view, seen by Lyell and by Chambers, is a blind and random process in which neither the gifted individual, such as Hallam was, especially for Tennyson, neither the gifted individual nor entire species, plural, have any claim on a loving Father God, because implicated in the nature of nature, if you are a believer, is the nature of the author of nature. So this is very disturbing for Tennyson. So let me give you an example of what one of the things Robert Chambers says. Robert Chambers says quite bluntly, it is clear that the individual is to the author of nature a consideration of inferior moment. Or again, Charles Lyell, earlier still, in 1830-33, he had anticipated this lack of confidence in what we are happy still to call the natural order on the title page of his second volume. And the title page of Lyell's second volume carries the quotation, "It is not only the individual that perishes, but whole species." Now what you have here is the beginning of, this is laying the grounds for the emergence of the science we come to know as paleontology. Paleontology, etymologically, means simply the study of ancient being. You'd be aware of the word ontology as being. So in fact, these were the guys who, Lyell was a geologist, so he found fossils. But these are guys who were delighted to find fossils which proved both the existence and sudden extinction of whole species prior to the arrival of mankind. The prehistoric species which were simply created and then wiped out. Tennyson was, I think it's no exaggeration to say he was appalled by the vision that this offered. In the traditional elegy, as in Milton's Lycidas. The lament is that neither nature nor the gods could save the precious individual. That's a kind of common trope, if you like, in elegy. I think in Milton's Lycidas, what the speaker says is, "Where were ye nymphs when the waters closed over the head of Lycidas?" And he was drowned. And of course he laments the fact that there is no supernatural power to save the much-loved individual. In the case of Tennyson, this lament is raised to a new pitch of intensity, is expanded, if you like, as well, as the poet includes painfully explicit rebuttals of what is now seen as a wholly alien nature. Nature is wholly alien, indifferent, if you like, ruthless, impersonal, all of those things. So this becomes the disturbing revelation. So you find in Tennyson, in In Memoriam, you find him at one point describing nature as a phantom, a hollow form with empty hands. Now this is remarkable, and this is why I mentioned Wordsworth earlier. This is only approximately 50 years after Wordsworth could claim in Tintern Abbey, which was published in 1798, that he had found nature, I would use the word theophanic, certainly hierophanic. In other words, for Wordsworth, nature revealed, if not God himself, at least the sacred, or the numinous. God was nature revealed something transcendent. I'm going to quote the famous lines to you from Tintern Abbey, which I've abbreviated, you'll be glad to hear because you'll be familiar with them. He says in Tintern Abbey, "I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, a motion and a spirit that rolls through all things." So Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey. Less than 50 years later, because, as I say, the poem was published by Tennyson in 1850, it had been written in the years before that, you have Tennyson talking about nature as a phantom, a hollow form with empty hands. So this is a very dramatic shift. Now, if I were to take a little excursus here, I would say that the history of our attitude to nature was increasingly one of the neutralizing of nature, but there was a temporary halt put to that by writers like Wordsworth. In a sense, Romanticism is the last great attempt to reinstate a notion of transcendence and perhaps even spirituality into Western experience. It doesn't last long, but this is it points to the popularity of Platonism as an index of that. Platonism was very popular with Shelley, for example. It's the idea, it's the wish to believe that there's something beyond the material world, and that there is in fact something other than materialism. Is what Romanticism is trying to do. But no sooner has Wordsworth appeared than we are into Tennyson's despair. Now this is not confined simply, by the way, to England. I want to remind you of the greatest novel in English, which is Melville's Moby Dick, which was, again, in the mid-19th century, published in 1851. Seems to be an anomalous time, 1850, 1851. But in Melville's Moby Dick, the suggestion is we're moving into even more somber territory. Because one suggestion in Moby Dick, although it is only one major suggestion among many, is that nature is not just indifferent, but is the mediator or embodiment of the diabolical intentions of a vindictive creator. That's what Ahab believes. Now, Ahab's not the only character. I mean, I'm saying this is one suggestion among many. But it shows how complex the situation has become over the whole question of the nature of nature and the nature of the author of nature. So that's the background in which you come to Hopkins. And in my reading, Hopkins begins to look pretty singular and in a way unrepresentative of Victorian or late 19th century culture. There used to be an old cliche exam question which ran something as follows. Academics were fond of it. In spite of his technical and stylistic innovations, Hopkins is at heart simply another Victorian poet. Well, not in my book he isn't, because he transcends a lot of this problem I'm talking about by his Christian belief. And I'll expand on that just a little, and I'll modify slightly by talking about, referring back to the first lecture we heard this morning. Anyway, the exceptionalism we speak of probably owes its source not to Hopkins but to Newman and the Tractarians, who affected what was in essence, a Christian revival in the Oxford movement. And that influenced Hopkins, and indeed Hopkins, as you know, was received into the Catholic Church by no less a figure than Newman himself. So I'll be looking at the poem by Hopkins in a moment, but I want to note that the poem The Windhover is importantly dedicated. It's dedicated, I quote, to Christ our Lord. And I'll be laying particular emphasis on that dedication because it's a very deliberate and important one. And when I've done that, I'll, by contrast, look at a poem by Hardy, which to me is an almost perfect example of the agnostic poem. That is, keeping its options open. Agnosticism, by the way, is usefully described as skepticism in matters regarding metaphysics. So agnosticism for me is an open kind of thing. I don't like the word skepticism. I think the word skepticism became contaminated, possibly in the course of the 18th century, and became associated with negative attitude. So I prefer to go back to the ancient Greeks and Pyrrho and call it Pyrrhonism. Pyrrhonism means I don't know this, nor do I know that. I'm open. Modern skepticism tends to say, well, I don't think so. There's a slight shift in emphasis between the two. Okay, coming to Hopkins in The Windhover. Hopkins avoids the big problem entailed in the phrase nature of nature, because as an Orthodox Christian, he simply bypasses it. And in my reading, he draws upon the theological view of the cosmos, or in terms of our immediate environment, nature, as a manifestation, in particular, of the second person of the Trinity. Now, theologically, I believe it is possible to hold the following. There are three manifestations of the second person of the Trinity. The first is God the Son, existing from all eternity and through all eternity. The second is Jesus of Nazareth, who, through the mystery of the Incarnation, is the second person of the Trinity revealed in human history, which in turn is an extension of the long-standing Jewish belief that God himself is always involved, is deeply involved in human history. So it's a very, I say, almost risky extension of that tradition. But also the third manifestation of God the Son is that the cosmos is a manifestation in its entirety. And to justify that, you've only to remember the first chapter of the Gospel of St. John. Again, I'll abbreviate it. In the beginning was the Word. This is the second person of the Trinity as the Word or the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Through him all things came to be. All things. Not one thing had its being but through him. All that came to be had life in him. So the source of the creation of the cosmos, or the manifestation, I prefer the manifestation, is in fact the second person of the Trinity. And of course, Hopkins could accept this. If you want to see another example of this kind of emphasis, look at the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 16. So hence, for this kind of believer, the cosmic presence of Christ. This nature is charged with the grandeur of God because of that substructure, theological substructure. Now, as it happens, if I can switch tack for a moment, there is in the tradition of English Romanticism a whole idea, a whole sequence of bird, or more correctly, bird song poems. And Hopkins would have been aware of the most famous of these, which is undoubtedly Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. And he would have known about that. But while both Keats and Hopkins celebrate beauty, Keats focuses on the beauty of the nightingale's song, where Hopkins focuses on the beauty or grace of the kestrel's dynamic movement. And I put this in shorthand by saying that, in a sense, ballet replaces song in terms of beauty or elegance. Above all, the kestrel is affirmative energy, the affirmative energy of life itself, expressed in the most elegant of forms. So let me now, familiar as it is, inflict upon you a reading of The Windhammer, which is on the handout. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn's drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy. Then off, forth on swing as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend. The hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird. The achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute, beauty and valour and act, oh, ere pride plume, here buckle. And the fire that breaks from me then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. No wonder of it. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine, and blue bleak embers, ah my dear, fall gall themselves and gash gold vermilion. Now, the sonnet normally is divided formally into an octet and a sestet, but also logically it carries that division within it. And I want to argue here that the sestet is significantly different from the octet, but that both are given meaning by the dedication to Christ our Lord. And the first what you have, first of all, is a celebration of spontaneous life. The life of the universe, the energy of the universe, the divine energy of the universe, if you wish to call it such. This is what's done, first of all, in those wonderful inscapy moments of the rolling level underneath them, steady air. Many a time I've sat on an airplane and looked out the window and that phrase has come to my mind, the rolling level underneath them, steady air. or again as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend. You're getting the actual thisness of the act itself, the haikatas in Duns Scotus's word. Duns Scotus, who of course influenced Hopkins. But what I'm more interested in is the sestet. I think in many ways the octet speaks for itself. The sestet is different, and yet it is a different manifestation of the same Christ. Only this time, it is the Christ that emerges, or the Christ life that emerges from self-sacrifice or from self-denial. That's the kind of difference we have between the two halves of the two parts of the poem. Now the sestet, in spite of the continuity, still strikes us as a highly dramatic contrast. And I want to just comment on it. You're probably all familiar with the fact that some commentary has been expended on the word buckle. Does buckle mean the stricture, pulling in of the belt? And after I heard Kelsey speak about the argosy braces, I decided I would not inflict that upon the speaker in the poem. That kind of stricture would be too severe. So I prefer buckle to mean collapse inwards. What I'm thinking of is a collapsing inwards, buckling under pressure, which is freely willed, as it were, accepted. It's not from circumstance. And from that collapse inwards, one of the things that collapses is pride, which is, of course, the great enemy of sanctity or salvation or holiness, or call it what you will. And it's the vice most associated with ego or self. And from that kind of self-sacrifice, we're told, the fire that is a billion times lovelier breaks forth. Now the sestet here operates for me as a coda of mounting intensity, with a climax that is truly arresting. And I want to dwell on it. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine. Cillian derives from a medieval word meaning furrow. Why Cillian? Well, simple enough. Cillian has the first syllable, same first syllable as the word silver. So Cillian shine, silver shine. You're being got at, you're getting subliminal messages from the poem in the interest of getting you to believe in effulgence, a special light emerging from what is routine activity, sheer plod. Now it seems to me that the line here functions on at least two levels. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine. Holiness is what we're talking about now, not simply life or spontaneity, but the holiness that comes with a particular kind of discipline. Holiness need not, and perhaps does not, coexist with glamour. So farewell for now to the earlier aristocratic vocabulary of dauphin and chevalier. These are replaced by ploughman. It's, if you like, a sociological shift downwards. All in keeping with what we're told in Christianity. Remember the lines in the famous Christmas carol, Once in Royal David's City. I quote, "With the poor and mean and lowly lived on earth our Saviour holy." So the ploughman is sociologically, what we need, not the chevalier or the dauphin, whatever pronunciation you like. The last two lines, however, are loaded with a truly Shakespearean richness. At first, they may seem to simply promote a continuation of an established theme. The established theme would be the mundane or the prosaic. The mundane can be a source of unexpected power or beauty. Just as the plodding plough, habitually repeated, creates a surprising effulgence and shine, So, we are anticipating, blue bleak embers will reveal a similar beauty or glory. But the tone changes, it changes gear. The poem changes gear with the little phrase, "Ah, my dear," a direct address to the thou-ness of Jesus. You know the I thou thing and the I it thing from personalism, the philosophy of personalism. This becomes an I thou moment, "Ah, my dear." And the phrase that follows that contains a dense specificity which makes us pause. Blue bleak embers, ah my dear, this is the last line then coming, fall, gull themselves, and gash gold vermilion. Now, the trigger word there, I think, is gash. There's the wonderful musical sequence of fall, gall, gash. But gall also means to hurt oneself. Fall reminds us that Christ on the way to Calvary fell 3 times. So the gash prepares us to regard gold vermilion as in fact blood, the redness of blood. So in effect what I'm trying to argue here is, it's a very ambitious sonnet this. It's trying to first of all incorporate a manifestation of the Master of the universe, Christ, and align that with the self-denying Christ, who underwent, I should put this up, who underwent what theologians call kenosis, the Greek word, an emptying of the self, a disempowerment of the self, to become as one of the lowly, eventually being faithful unto death. That kind of total self-emptying as well. So that's the range of the poem. It's trying to incorporate these 2 large aspects of Christian theology, as I understand it. And that gold vermilion, you may say, where's the gold come from? I would not be surprised if it came from Shakespeare. I'm thinking of that very haunting but very difficult line in Macbeth, where the corpse of Duncan is found, his silver skin laced with his golden blood. The blood of Christ is always precious, so is gold. But of course, the line in Macbeth is a problem because it is not graphic realism. It's a kind of, what shall we call it, it's something like heraldic in its imagery, rather than realistic. Nonetheless, it gives us our cue, perhaps, for the gold in gold vermilion. And the final point I would make about this essay is that this constitutes not only a tribute to Christ the Saviour, Christ who died on the cross, but it's a self-admonition to the poet. He, as Christian priest, is called to a life of self-denial and self-sacrifice. And one point that struck me for the first time when I was writing this, it's worth noting that at the time of the composition of the poem, Hopkins was less than 2 months away from his 33rd birthday. It being the tradition that the age of Christ when he died on the cross was 33. So it seems to me that this is a self-admonition as well. Now, there's more one could say about this poem, but I think I've expressed my admiration for it sufficiently. I want to turn now, however, to the darkling thrush. And this again is self-evident. With this poem we move from dawn to dusk, we move from sunrise to sunset. But the energy, we're losing also the energy and dynamism of Hopkins's sunrise poem in order to encounter the deathly stasis of Hardy's sunset, announced in the poem, by the way, as the weakening eye of day. The weakening eye of day is, of course, the sun. The sun is sinking and weakening as it goes. And when I say death-like stasis, I have in mind, of course, the subtitle of the poem, which, sorry, not the subtitle, the title under which it was first published, By the Century's Deathbed. By the way, subsequently Hardy tried to claim the poem was written on December 31st, actually written, I think, on December 28th. But, you know, I suppose that's poetic license. We'll call it such, and then we get away with it. But anyway, the idea is that, of course, it's the end of the year, the end of the century, and I would also argue, perhaps the end of the Victorian period, because within a year, Queen Victoria will have departed. So it's the end of an era in a number of ways. Now, there are some elucidations. I'll read it in a moment. Hardy poses his own problems with his, I suppose the word is quirky vocabulary, but we had an exchange this morning, I remember, about the need to make it new in poetic language. You can't let the cliches rule. You have to renovate. Of course, the word purify the language of the tribe is the famous utterance, originally, I think, from Mallarmé in French. But this is before I read it, a coppice is, line 1 is a copse. It's a small wood or thicket. The vine stems are the tangled stems of last year's plants. The tangle there seems to me to be token not just a kind of mild disorder, but perhaps a self-thwarting. It's life that thwarts itself. It's not letting itself rise upwards, because that again produces a sense of stasis, of non-development. Anyway, I'll read the the last thing I want, line 10. The century's corpse art lent. Art lent I've seen glossed as meaning laid out, but I'm not entirely convinced by that. I'm more interested in the way in which the second syllable of that word echoes the very second word of the poem, I lent. The speaker, I believe, is weak himself. He's old and weak, perhaps, that's why he's leaving. But this is the poem. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. The land's sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outwent, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. The ancient pulse of German birth was shrunken, hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. At once, a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy good night air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. Now, if you read that poem with feeling, you find it hard to keep your voice steady in the last line, I have to say. You know, the poem, because I know all the poems by Hardy, in which he hears others singing in the church, he's in the church, he can't join in, and he wonders, what is it they can see that I can't see? You know, why am I excluded this way? You know, and here he is once more excluded, and yet hearkening to the quote-unquote sign, if it is a sign, but an obvious sign, of course. Okay, now I love this poem because I've had enough experience teaching it, particularly in tutorials, and I can tell you from experience that when you teach this poem in a tutorial, the vote usually splits right down the middle. You get people who say it's It's a positive poem, because after all there is the offer of hope. And you get others who say, oh, come on, the gloom is so dominant, you can't hope to dispel the gloom with a little bit of bird note activity, you know. So this is what we need to do. Now, by the way, just to say one thing, the word darkling in the title, you might at first think that that's an adjective. It is in fact an adverb. It means in the dark or in the darkness. And it's a very unusual word. It's found in Shakespeare. It's found in Shakespeare's King Lear and A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's also found in Hardy's near contemporary, Matthew Arnold, We Are Heroes on a Darkling Plain. But the key, most signal instance of the use of the word in the early 19th century is Keats. Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Darkling, I listen, he says in his own garden about himself listening to the nightingale. I am listening in the dark. So any late Victorian poet who is writing and putting the word darkling in his title is pretty much waving a flag saying, don't forget Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. So therefore we are right to see this as, as a kind of reminiscence, and I might argue perhaps an ironic reminiscence of the Ode to a Nightingale. Because see, I'm going to complicate matters now. And what I want to suggest here, and I'll finish on this, is that I want to offer you two different readings. I call them simply the naive reading and the ironic reading. Part of my thesis is that we poor victims of the 21st century, having been through everything we've been through, are saturated in irony. It's very, very hard for us to transcend irony. That's one of the that's one of the victimizations of the age we live in. The cultural context of what you live in. I could talk for ages about that, but I better not start. Okay, first of all, the straightforward, naive reading is that we have a poem which, in the face of dire circumstance, offers a genuine, possibly redemptive experience. Negativity is overcome, and in spite of what is clearly the dominant logic of the poem, we arrive at a positive conclusion. And I sometimes like to read the Darkling Thrush, bearing in mind the famous lines from the great concluding scene from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, when against a background of highly evocative music, it's a marvellous nighttime scene, one of the great scenes in Shakespeare. It's one of the great scenes in Shakespeare because Shakespeare had no need to write it. It's a kind of bonus. The action's all finished, you know, but he just throws in this massive stream of poetry and drama and stuff, a kind of bonus right at the end. But Portia sees from some distance the light burning in her hall, and she comments, how far that little candle throws his beams. So shines a good deed in a naughty world. Now there you have a paradoxical situation. This is only a little candle, and yet, in spite of, or maybe because of, the surrounding darkness, it makes a huge impact. And that's a wonderful line. I find myself in moments of idleness or slight despair saying, so shines a good deed in a naughty world. How desperately in this naughty world we live in now do we need the effulgence of the occasional good deed. And that's why the line probably haunts me. So the candle is little and yet has an effect. The thrush is small, frail and small, but his song still conveys a kind of, not just hope, but conveys a capitalized hope. And I'm trying not to let you see my next slide too quickly, because otherwise I'd spoil my argument. That's the naive reading, so shines a good deal in the naughty world. The ironic reading for me comes from Monty Python's Life of Brian. Always look on the bright side of life. Now you need to remember the context of this in the movie. The context is a whole gang of guys being crucified. And they're all singing, always look at them on the bright side of life. Now it's palpably, I'm using this word deliberately, it's palpably absurd. These guys are victims that apparently don't even know they're victims. You know. Now in spite of that, of course, the great British public has taken the song to its heart and made out of it a little anthem of constant encouragement and exhortation. But they're in context in the movie. It's a revelation of really, there's no language can do it justice. It's clearly absurd that these guys are all crucified singing always looking at the bright side of life. So I'm trying to see if I can argue that the thrush is in a similar situation, because he too is a victim. He is totally subject to mortality himself. In Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, to which I think this is an ironic riposte, in Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, Keats can hail the bird as immortal bird, because the song will go on forever. The song will go on and go on, as whoever it is sings it. The song will last forever. Therefore, the poet can hail that nightingale, saying, "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird." That's Keats and the Nightingale. But here you have a fully diminished and de-glamorized figure. He's frail and old, and like the rest of everything in the poem, he's on his way out. And yet he insists in indulging in this irrational spasm, I'm going to call it, of what the poet thinks might be hope. By the way, I could develop that a lot more if I were to invoke one of Hardy's favourite philosophers, Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer knew that we are all committed to a love of life, and this seemed to Schopenhauer quite the wrong way to go, and he therefore preferred the saint to others, because the saint abstained from the world. He was influenced by Oriental religion as well. So the idea that you go on hoping for, the idea that you surrender to what another philosopher, Bergson, called the élan vital, the life force, that to Schopenhauer would seem, that's not the way to go. You'll fill yourself full of desires that can never be fulfilled. You're in a cul-de-sac. Get out of it. You know, stay away from the world in that guise. And anyway, this is the line of argument that might further bolster what I'm saying. And here's this little thrush, himself subject not only to mortality, but what the existentialists love to call contingency, or the force of circumstance, with his blast beruffled plume. I love that line. It's very, very precise. You can see the image. You know, the thrush is there and he's practically being blown away, but he's still foolishly singing away. Now, all of that said, I have a bad conscience, and so I have to conclude by saying, and yet. The poet, in his sad wisdom, accumulated by this stage over many years, may indeed realize that there's no apparent basis for the ecstatic sound he hears, but in what can be seen as an instance of his wisdom, he refuses to dismiss the song of the thrush entirely. In other words, I believe the ending of the poem is totally open. It cannot arrive at closure. It is impossible to bring this poem to closure. So you have the open ending expressed through what is, in fact, the more you think about it, exquisitely balanced phrasing. And the end of the poem again is, perhaps there trembled through his happy midnight air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. Now, it's very hard to paraphrase that. If I'm unaware of it, does that mean it doesn't exist? But there is a blessed hope there available if I choose to believe in it. But this speaker is neither believer nor non-believer. He is in fact agnostic. And therefore I say that this open ending is an example of the perfect agnostic poem. As I say, agnosticism is a form of skepticism. And the poet leaves it open to us, the readers, as to whether we wish to believe in the capitalized hope, or whether we think that, maybe use another example, the little thrush is a bit like Winnie in Happy Days, whistling away while life piles up all around her, and the sands that pile up around her are in fact death. And Winnie will not admit that she's being overwhelmed. Is this heroic, or is it folly? That's the kind of question Beckett raises in Happy Days. The bias, it seems to be in Beckett, is towards believing it's folly and blindness. The bias in Hardy's poem may not be quite so obvious, but I threw in the Beckett parallel just to try and hold up some kind of mirror, perhaps a distorting mirror, to the poem we're talking about. So anyway, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Now we have time for questions or discussion. Any comment? Yes, go ahead.
When you're looking at the Windhover, you cut it into two pieces, the 8th and the 6th. I just wonder whether it wouldn't be more profitable to say that I caught is exactly what he does with the second part as much as what he does with the first part. The amazing thing about the first part is he captures all this brute beauty as well as the bird. So it's not really two separate parts, it's one continuous argument.
Well, I suppose what I was meant by that splitting in two parts is that these are different aspects of the Christ our Lord, you see, that the octet celebrates, in the Catholic Mass, for example, the priest at one point says, addressing God, all life, all holiness comes from you. Now, I know that William Blake said, all life is holy. But that's a tricky one. Is all life holy? So I would tend, therefore, I'm getting a bit, I'm uneasy with my own Bangerism here, I'd have to say. But I would tend to see, if I were trying to make a distinction between octet and sestet, perhaps I overstated it, I would be talking about vitalism, vitality, life in the octet, and a kind of counterpart to that in terms of energy compressed, as it were, by discipline, and becoming then an even more explosive force in the world, if you like. Explosive is not probably correct, but you see it getting at the image of if you compress it in, it becomes a million times more dangerous, lovelier, more dangerous. That's what I was trying to do. But yeah, you may have a point. Maybe I was overdoing the
just for your amusement, my reading of this one is a modern advertisement possibility which says, "Buy bird, get God free."
Yes, well, it's a big improvement on the albatross anyway, you know.
Well, it's which bit of the bird you're buying.
Right?
It's which bit of the bird are you buying?
All right. Well, all of it. The brute beauty, the valour, the act, the air, flying, plume, the lot. And the bonus. get free.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think though, you see that the self-admonition is important. Remember we were talking earlier this morning about the possibility that there is a conflict in Hopkins between what we call his selving as a poet and the self-denial, self-sacrifice required of him as a Christian priest, you know. And I think I wanted to highlight that as well. You know, he can rejoice naively, as it were, in the spontaneity of the movements of the bird, but it seems to be incumbent upon him to reinterpret that symbol, or reinterpret the moment, I should say, and find a different kind of symbolism to express something which is not quite the same as what was expressed in the first 8 lines. You know, the blue bleak embers. You know, bleak hits you there with a bit of a shock. You know, that's a hardy word. You know, you don't expect it at this point in Hopkins's poetry. You know, you know, I should also have said, by the way, just when I have a chance to say this, my idea that Hopkins sees the cosmic Christ, sees Christ, the universe as a manifestation of Christ, that might need some modification in the view of what Nia was saying earlier this morning. You know, I think that where I now put it is, that's his normative way of seeing the universe, but it probably wasn't his only way of seeing it. But I think that's the theological grounding for the first part of the poem. You know?
But does that dedication to Christ our Lord, does that not reduce the poem to a theological poem, to an ideological almost poem? And I think I can read that poem as a spiritual poem and leave JC out of it. And I think the dedication reduces it to a Christian interpretation or a religious interpretation that I think spoils it. And I think if we can forget about that, it's much more open, it's more beautiful even, and you can marry that into the closing lines of Hardy's poem. The essence of what Hopkins sees is the same as the essence of what Hardy sees, or Beckett even, who you and I might disagree on that, but that there is something special there, something eternal, something that lasts, that's not necessarily God or religious based.
Well, the thing is though, I mean, how would you interpret the Gash Gold Vermilion then? I mean, why?
As you have often said, as the lines on the page. And I wouldn't apply them necessarily to the crucifixion.
Okay. I can't disagree with that, because clearly, you know, it's Stanley Fish, isn't it, who says, "Is there a text in this class?" I mean, there's so many different ways of reading a text, you know, and I mean, that's a way for me to make sense of it. I have to admit, I lean very much on the dedication to Christ our Lord. Not every poem of Hopkins is dedicated in that way, you know, and I think it is significant that he wrote it 2 months before he reached his 33rd birthday. I think there's something significant in that fact, you know. You know, when a man approaches 33 and he's in religious life, he's bound to take cognizance of the fact. What's the great poem by Thomas Kinsella? They are not whole who reach the age of Christ. Take murder. Yeah. it's very deeply embedded in the Christian mind, I think, the age 33. And I'm sure, that Hopkins was very conscious of the fact that he was a couple of months away from that. But I would be having argued for closure to Hardy. I can hardly insist on closure, and one reading, mono reading, with regard to the Windhover. So I take your point.
Okay, anyone? Yes.
Yes, the first part of the sestet there, a billion times more lovely or more dangerous. Is that similar to Yeats's "A Terrible Beauty is Born" when he refers to the men of and women of 1916 and the discipline they had, the willingness to lay down their lives for their cause? And also, you could, if you want to go further, you could take in some of the deeds and actions being done today by jihadists and people like that. A terrible beauty who sacrifice everything, and what helps to get them there is this total dedication, self-discipline, and, as I say, dedication to the cause.
Well, you see, I would at this point turn ideological on this again, because the major difference between Christ and the leaders of Easter 1916, and it irritates me hugely, the whole Pierce messianic nonsense. When Christ decided to die, he didn't see the need to harm or kill anybody else. That's the crucial difference. In fact, when Peter takes the sword, when one of the Peter, some version Peter, cuts the ear off the servant in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ says, "Those who live by the sword perish by the sword," and he heals the man's ear. So to do violence to yourself, jihadist, in order to fulfill a cause, it might have something to be said for it, depending on the context. But to do violence to yourself, which simultaneously does violence to others, is simply, to me, not admirable. I can't see anything admirable in it. I mean, when I think now of 1916, I think primarily of Joe Duffy's book and the children who were killed. I mean, and even in 1916, Terrible Beauty is Born, Yeats does ask the almost unanswerable question: was it needless sacrifice after all? It's to unleash violence is. It just simply goes against the grain with me. If it means killing other people, I simply can't live with that. I can't accept it. I can't come to terms with it really at all, because it's totally against what everything I would believe in. Sorry, Paddy.
Yeah, I think in some ways the poem almost specifically rejects that sort of thing, because in the first picture you have the picture of a knight, essentially, you have this chivalric thing, and it's essentially, it may not be violent, but it's a warlike, and it's full of war imagery. And then in the second, in the sestet, then it's quite literally swords into plowshares, and I think that must have been at the back of his mind. And if you take Buckle, I don't think you need to choose between readings of Buckle. I think there are a number in there, and I always start with the point that if somebody as conscious of words as Hopkins is, uses a word that can be interpreted in a number of ways, he does it deliberately. I think it's reductive to take one, and to me that the buckling there, and it's the brute beauty and valour and act. He says that buckles, it falls down. He is also saying, I think, that the beauty that's in it and the energy buckles in the sense of tying together, as somebody might buckle on armour and things like that. I think those two things are there. And so that he, says,
I think he's deliberately saying that violent imagery, warlike imagery, is one aspect of the glory of God, but it's a limited aspect. And when that comes together with a greater thing, you get something that's more dangerous in the sense of it's more revolutionary, can change things.
Yes, I think that revolutionary is a good word, yeah.
And through the ordinariness of the ploughman, so that's literally swords into ploughshare, the ordinary of the ember fire that when it's kicked over flames up again, and from these he gets, I think what is crucifixion image, because the fall gall is given, they gave him gall to drink, and
Yes.
gash,
Yeah,
gash in his side, so fall, gall, gash are 3 words from the crucifixion, and I don't, I understand what Arthur is saying. I think the poem can be read in ways that are, that non-Christian people or people who don't believe in that message can appreciate. But Hopkins put the dedication there. You can't get away from that. It's an essential part of the poem.
Yeah, what I was doing with, as you probably realise, with Dauphin and Chevalier. By the way, I said Dauphin because I was saying Chevalier. I could have said Dauphin and Chevalier, but if I'd done that, I would have lost the rhyme in Chevalier. So I went for pronunciation of both. But what I was doing that was I was seeing it in terms of aristocracy, and then the ploughman being the humble labourer, if you like. But I'm very much taken with your idea of swords into ploughshares. I think that's the thinking of a poet, really. That you should come up with that you're thinking metaphorically. That the plough is not simply a real plough in the poem, but is a reminiscence of the metaphor turning swords into plowshares. I think that enriches the reading. And of course, I should have picked up on gall,
Yes.
as gall and vinegar to drink. I should have picked up on that. I simply know that gall also means to hurt oneself. I was thinking of gash and fall and hurting oneself.
Is that not, just on the violence thing, is that not an expression of self-violence, self-harm, the falling, the galling, the gashing? So rather than the violence going towards others, this self-discipline is directed towards yourself, towards oneself, and the beatings and the flagellation that was part of, I'm not sure whether the Jesuits went in for it or not, but certainly some of the orders, they encouraged that sort of self-violence themselves. Is that not part of it?
Well, I think that this is, I agree, the iconography of Christianity has a dangerous kind of tendency to encourage in the spectator of the cross, etc., perhaps some kind of subconscious motivation to harm themselves, to deny themselves in an extreme way. Self-harm is the phrase we use. It is said that and I have no way of knowing if this is true, the Eastern Orthodox Church places much greater emphasis than the Western Church, the Latin Church, on the resurrection, and that the crucifixion is really much too central in the imagination of Western Christians. That really the whole point of the sequence is the rising on the last day, and the suffering. There can be a kind of I won't say it's masochistic, but there can be a kind of fascination with suffering which is not healthy. I would certainly agree that if that's the point you're hinting at, that is the case. I've always had trouble with that myself. That You know, if you say that you're going to, I think, is it in Joyce's portrait? Joyce is a wonderful analyst of these psychological implications. That is it Stephen who sits deliberately in an uncomfortable position so that he can offer up the pain for the souls of perpetrator or something. You know, I mean, this is not healthy stuff, and we should be wary of the potency of some of the iconography of the crucifixion. You know, when you look, for example, at the late medieval version of the crucifixion done by Grunewald, you know, that's the one where the body is all twisted, and you can see the thorns going right into the skull. You know, do we really need that kind of detail? You know, what purpose does it serve? I didn't myself see the Mel Gibson movie, but that's because I refused to go and see it. I'm not interested in seeing, you know, massive suffering by quote unquote God. You know, I didn't go to for the same reason that when I was an undergraduate, there were pictures in the library for a while, in my first year when I went to Queen's in Belfast. And they were very harrowing and graphic pictures of the Holocaust. And I refused to look at them because I felt if I look at these, I cannot bring the authentic weight of feeling these require to bear upon them. And if I can't do that, then I'm becoming a voyeur. Do you know what I mean? It's unhealthy. You know, if I'm going to be horrified, I shouldn't be horrified. I should fall to my knees. I should do what Pope Francis did recently, simply lapse into total silence, and more or less imply this is unspeakable. You know. But I don't think, you know, the human imagination is it loves to flirt with danger of various kinds, you know? Including the danger of this fascination with suffering. You know? So I'm not, you know, this is breaking news, folks. I am not in favour of suffering. You know?
The Catholic Church, our Christian Church, was very much in favour of suffering, and there were indulgences and so on like that, and the way the cross and so forth, suffering and, as I say, self-mortification, and those, they were strongly encouraged.
Well, I think
ashes and all the rest of them.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the business of self-laceration, you know, people lashing themselves for their sins, I just don't think that's a healthy way to proceed. In fact, you could argue exactly the opposite. I mean, the grace abounding argument. The grace abounding argument is quite simple. Simply that you have been saved because of Christ, so therefore you don't have to, all you've got to do is accept that salvation in faith. You know, the suffering has been done for you. He is the scapegoat. So there's no point in undue guilt, for example, which is another form of self-laceration. And there's no point in actual physical self-harm. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for occasional self-discipline. I think that's you know, I love the story about the test carried out with the children, you know, on the sweets. You know this one, don't you? That if they waited a while, they would get 2 sweets, but they could take 1 sweet at any time before they finished the problem. But if they did that, they didn't get the second. And they discovered that the children who could write and finish the problem and get the 2 sweets, they followed them up, they became more successful, more balanced, more successful citizens and so forth. And I think there is a need for self-discipline. But self-discipline should be something, I mean, we know, we've had Freud to warn us against, you know, motivations that are not fully conscious. We have to be careful that we don't think we're doing something good when there's some dark force within us working for the harm of ourselves, you know. That's not helpful.
Right. I'd like to thank Brian for that very incisive analysis, very detailed, and the fact that it gave rise to such an interesting discussion with different interpretations. It's proof that he communicated very well. So thank you again, Brian, for a very thorough piece of work.